Today's text comes from Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 through 33. Hear the word of the Lord. The steadfast love of Yahweh never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Yahweh is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Good is Yahweh to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. Good it is that one should wait patiently for the salvation of Yahweh. Good it is for one to bear the yoke in youth, to sit alone in silence when the Lord has imposed it, to put one's mouth to the dust. There may yet be hope. To give one's cheek to the smiter and be filled with insults. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. On a recent trip out, Karen and I had the opportunity to speak with some bikers. Being a pastor, the issue of theology normally comes up, and today's topic, or that day's discussion, circled around to questions of God's involvement in human life, God's dictating our actions, the role of free will, and where does God fit in orchestrating the events that circle us? Does God work like a puppet master pulling our strings? These are notions that I hear raised often enough. They're common discussions. Free will, predestination. Does God work akin to the myths of the Greek fates who sit around weaving the looms of our destinies, orchestrating the minutiae of our living? It is one thing to affirm that God is not like those mythical Greek faiths. And yet it is something different to entrust God with the whole range of our experiences. To wrestle with God's place in our lives. Grappling with how much is the freedom of our actions and their consequences, and what is God's role? Interacting in our lives, guiding our circumstances, and caring for us amid the ups and downs of life's experiences. Today's passage we read from the book of Lamentations flows from a dark place. These words attributed to or related to the character of Jeremiah speak of a time and occasion in which Judah was being ripped out of the promised land and carried off into exile. The prophet speaks and declares his anguish over the chaos, the uncertainty, the turmoil in which his people were living. Ripped out of a life of meaning, understandably because of their failure to measure up to Yahweh's demands of justice toward the poor, the widow, the orphan. Ezekiel is very clear in laying the responsibility for exile at the hands of the leaders of Israel and Judah, for failing to measure up to the demands of justice, specifically economic justice for the poor. Isaiah issues a series of diatribes not only against Israel and Judah, but all the nations around for very similar sins of injustice and oppression wreaked upon the powerless, the vulnerable. Amos speaks with a similar voice, starting off talking about the sins that Israel was so quick to condemn among all the nations round about, until he focused his attention back on Israel and Judah, saying, we are no different. The same sins that we point out in those around us are our own sins, our own failures. And so we find ourselves beset by God's just reckoning of our faults and failures. The writer of Lamentations says, life has been turned upside down, it seems. Everything that we have known, everything that we have relied on, our position in the world as God's chosen people seems to have been pulled out from under us, and we know not where we stand. And yet, he says, there is hope. Hope because behind the discipline in which we find ourselves, behind the upheaval, the uncertainty, the loss, we know that it is Yahweh who is still with us and behind us and calling us forward. And our hope resides in the long-suffering, enduring love of God, Yahweh's steadfast mercy and compassion. So we understand, because of the character of Yahweh, that despite the difficulty that we must go through, despite the uncertainty, the doubt, the despair and hardship, we know that we are not abandoned. We are not left simply to our own devices. We are yet called forward, knowing that Yahweh will yet step in to redeem. God is not through with us. We may have been waylaid by the world's superpower, by a foreign idolatrous nation. We may have been carted off now to serve as slaves to empire. Yet there is hope for us. Because despite the hardship, despite the toil, despite the difficulty, the grief, the loss, Yahweh is yet present. We must wait upon Yahweh. We must hope not that we can right the ship, not that we can turn around the world and bring about new direction, new wealth, new prosperity, new power for Israel and Judah. Rather, we must wait upon Yahweh. because we were the chosen people by Yahweh to represent Him, His justice, His grace, His mercy, His love for all people and nations. And it is in our service to Yahweh that we will find meaning and renewal in the days and years to come. We hope because we know in whom we have believed. We understand the character of the one who has called us to be more than we settled for on our own. We know the character of the one who covers us with grace and mercy despite our failures, who even in the midst of His discipline engages us with compassion, with steadfast love, with mercy. One who comes to cover us in grace, though our actions never measure up to Yahweh's standards. This is the hope the writer sets before us. He says, yes, God is behind the calamity that we have experienced and is still before us. God is in the midst of the circumstances of life in which we find ourselves. But God's will is not to afflict. It is not to aggrieve. It is not to harm. It is rather to transform us until we become wholly dependent upon God's grace, love, compassion, and mercy, that we might claim it for ourselves and for all others as well. We hope because of the character in whom we hope. We hope because we understand who God is. Yahweh is not some deity who acts out of whim and capriciousness, delighting in punishment and condemnation. Rather, one who calls us forward in grace, in love, compassion, and redemption, desiring good for one and all. This is the one in whom we have placed our confidence. This is the one who calls us forward, granting us confidence to face the uncertainties of life. Confident because they are not the final chapter. We may struggle through for the moment, but we know that beyond the struggles that we face, God is still present, covering us with grace, compassion, mercy, calling us forward that we might yet become the people we have been called to be, transformed into the image of his Son. That beyond the chaos of the world around us, we and through us others might see the light of compassion and mercy, of steadfast love and grace, pouring forth and redeeming us despite our failures.